Hey folks, John Peniel here, and it's another beautiful day in the South Hills, Spokane. So I'm going to talk about rock and roll. I'm going to talk about rock groups and rock artists, probably mostly from the 70s, but I might touch on some groups from the 60s and maybe 80s and 90s. We'll see where this goes. I'm just going to offer some opinions, some personal insights into rock groups and rock artists. So let's, before I begin, I'll send out a few invites. Boom, 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 boom. Ah. All right, good enough. All right, so I'm just kind of musing on band dynamics. You know, what goes into what makes a band great and what makes it not so great, right? And I used to be in a band myself. I was in a jazz band back 15 or so years ago. As a matter of fact, I started this jazz band along with a former friend. We're not really talking terms now, but I still see him as a friend. You know, I still have friendly feelings for him, but the feeling isn't mutual apparently. But we started this band here in Spokane about 17 years ago, and basically we started the jazz scene here in Spokane. And the band still is going on, but I left the band many years ago, and it's a really good band. Anyway, I know a little something about band dynamics. You know, I know how it goes. You know, ego clashes and whatnot. So I'm going to talk about that. You know, I think it's a very interesting topic. It's something that we don't really think much about. You know, when we listen to music, we say, "Oh, that's my favorite band," you know, but you never think about the personalities behind the music, you know, like all the things that went into making the music, you know, the personalities, you know, all the band all the inner band dynamics, you know. So all right, let's start off with a band that many of you probably never heard of. It was 1970, band called Quatermass. Quatermass, yeah, Quatermass. A weird, odd name. An English group, and they only put out one album, and it would be classified as a heavy progressive rock album, which means that the music has complicated rhythms and so forth, but it's also heavy. You know, the singing is more of a hard rock sort of thing, right? And there were three guys in the band, if I'm not mistaken. The lead singer was also the bassist. His name was he passed away a couple of years ago, I think. His name was John Gustafsson. I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, but he started that band, Quatermass, and it's a classic album. They only put out one album, and I've seen some live performances of them on YouTube when they were performing back in 1970, 71, and the singer, John Gustafsson, was powerful. I mean, this guy, he could really sing. Definitely had a presence, right? And he could play bass too really well. And they put out some classic songs on that record. Black Sheep of the Family is one of them. Anyway, they disbanded, and John Gustafsson moved on to other groups, famous groups. he immediately joined Roxy Music back in '73, I think. You know Roxy Music, right? It's basically, it was a glam proto new wave group, basically. That's how I see it anyway. They were like doing new wave before new wave became a thing, basically. Kind of an art rock group, an English group that hit the scene around 1971, 1972, and they made a big splash and put out a bunch of albums. Not a bunch of albums, but at least 5 or 6 albums throughout the 70s. And so anyway, John Gustafsson joined this group in '73, and by this time the band had put out a couple albums. And he gets relegated to being a mere bassist. He doesn't sing. He's just in the background, playing the bass. As a matter of fact, I've watched a couple of videos of Roxy Music playing live back in the early '70s. I've watched more than a couple. I've watched a couple dozen over the past 5 or 6 years, and it's interesting to watch it. The lead singer is Bryan Ferry. I'm sure some of you have heard of this. He's famous, English singer. And definitely the star of the group. He's up there, and he's dressed like Elvis, but like in a sort of glam sort of way, and he's preening up there in front of the stage. Clearly he's got some ego issues, but what rock singer doesn't? But but when you look at the band as they're playing live, you sense that the music doesn't quite gel. There's some great musical ideas going on, but there's something off about the music of Roxy Music that just doesn't quite get it. And it just hit me today as to what that is that they were not a great live act. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't know how to play their instruments. They knew how to play their instruments pretty well. But there goes more into playing. There's more to being a great live act than playing your instruments well. There's a little thing called chemistry and band dynamics. And when you watch these early to mid '70s live performances of Roxy Music, you sense that there's no band dynamics going on at all. It's dead. The energy is dead. You look at the band members, they look bored out of their freaking mind. And that might have been just part of the act, but I'm not impressed with it. It's like, I'm not into that. I'm not into affectation, like putting on like a sort of bored, ennui, old world weariness sort of thing. It just seems like it's just like a put on to me, but I'm not into that. And so that gives the band a sort of lackluster live performance. And basically, they don't really perform as a true band when you look at Roxy Music. It's more like it's Bryan Ferry's band. It's Bryan Ferry and his backup band, basically, because he's out there in the front being the star, right? But when you look at the other guys, you look at the drummer, he looks like he's bored out of his skull, Then you look at the bassist, John Gustafsson, who is this dynamic, who was the dynamic bassist and lead singer of Quatermass a couple of years prior. All that dynamism is gone. You look at him and he's just barely looking up from his bass. He's just looking at his bass as he's playing. He looks very introverted. And you look at the other musicians. Eddie Jobson, who was the keyboardist at a certain time during a certain time of Roxy Music's existence. Eddie Jobson, who was basically a demigod when it came to the keyboard, because this guy was everywhere. He's been in a bunch of bands throughout the 70s, a lot of famous bands, and he had a massive keyboard prowess that would easily rival Emerson, the guy from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, easily. But when you look at him in Roxy Music, he's just, way in the background. You can sense that the energy's not there. And it's just that way with everybody. And then you look at Bryan Ferry, the front man, and he's just singing, crooning away. And you can't help but think you're seeing a singer and a backup band who's just there just to perform, and that's it. There is no true band dynamics. And I seriously fault Roxy Music with that. They could have been so much a much better band if Bryan Ferry would have just kind of toned down his ego and let everybody be a star in the band, so to speak, right? But he didn't do that because he's got colossal ego issues. How do I know that? I just know. Anyway, it's just putting two and two together. Because I've been in bands, and when you observe how bands operate, and you see how things don't quite add up, well, you can kind of like read between lines and say, oh, okay, this guy's got a big ego. And sure enough, you look on the internet and you research Bryan Ferry, and you find out that's what he's been accused of, being a rampant egomaniac. But it's just a shame, though, that he was that way, because if he had just toned down his ego and let his other band members shine, they would have been they would have been right up there with Led Zeppelin, maybe even better, because they had Eddie Jobson and John Gustafson, two monstrous players. As a matter of fact, the inimitable John Wetton eventually joined the group Roxy Music sometime, I think, in the mid-70s, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But John Wetton, the bassist for King Crimson back in the 70s, he started out in a band called Family back in 70, 71. They were moderately successful. Then he moved on to King Crimson. Then he moved on to, I think, Roxy Music. Then he joined Uriah Heep back in the late 70s. This guy was everywhere. And, of course, he was in the very famous prog rock trio called UK, which was himself, John Wetton, Alan Holdsworth, of course, the inimitable Alan Holdsworth, and Bill Bruford, the famous Bill Bruford, the drummer from Yes. So he was in there. John Wetton was in Roxy Music, but you would never have known it because he was relegated to the background, because Bryan Ferry. Here's the thing: I'm not bashing Bryan Ferry. That's not my point. It just seems to be a perennial thing that goes on in rock groups that could be so much better if it wasn't for the one egomaniac in the group who's running the whole show, right? And you find that out that it's that way with that's my mom, with Roxy Music. Other groups were like that too. I'm trying to think. The Beatles could have been so much better if it hadn't been for the egomania of Paul McCartney and, to a lesser extent, John Lennon. Paul McCartney, a genius. Don't get me wrong, I love Paul McCartney, but he was an egomaniac, and he just ruled the roost, and he didn't let the others shine. He didn't even let John Lennon shine. But and as a result, the band suffered. They could have been so much better if they'd let George Harrison give more input, because he had a lot of great ideas, musical ideas and whatnot. Other bands, like Little Richard. Little Richard was was like that too. Did you know that Little Richard had Jimi Hendrix as his backup guitarist back before Jimi Hendrix became famous? Yeah, it was back in the early 60s, around 64, 65. Jimi Hendrix was a young 22-year-old or so who was trying to rise up the ranks, right? So he joined the Little Richard's band as his backup guitarist, and he was there for a while. But Little Richard fired Jimi Hendrix. Why? Because Jimi Hendrix was doing his rock star thing in the band. He was like letting it loose. He was playing the guitar solo, and the females out in the audience were screaming, and Little Richard didn't like this. Hey, I want them to scream at me. I'm the one that's supposed to be the pretty one here. That's what he said. He said, I'm supposed to be the pretty one here, not you. And so he fired Jimi Hendrix. So you find this happens so often, where you find a rock group that the rock musicians, they can play their instruments well, but the inner band dynamics suck, right? And they could be so much better if they just get over the ego thing, right? So, back to Roxy Music. Roxy Music should have been a super live band, but you watch them and they just sound okay, ho hum. Even though they had Eddie Jobson and John Gustafson, monstrous musicians. You can contrast that with the band UK, which was a prog rock group which came out in England back in '78. They put out only 2 albums. They existed. They only lasted from '77 to 1980. Then they disbanded. That was formed out of 3 massive, monstrous musicians: Eddie Jobson, the keyboard player; Alan Holdsworth, the guitarist, who passed away from us about 5 years ago; and Bill Bruford, the former drummer for Yes. Massively talented, all 3 of them. And you watched their live act, and their live act is phenomenal because they're all being stars. It's not just like one guy is out there doing his thing while the other 2 are just in the background just doing their thing, and not really adding much to it. No, they're all rise to the front, and it produces this very dynamic, vital live music, right? That's totally missing from groups like Roxy Music and the Beatles and so forth. So, excuse me. It's a beautiful evening out here. Anyway, I'm having a little pause here because I'm waiting for other thoughts to come to me. Okay, let's talk about some groups or rock artists that I think are severely overrated. I'm just going to be brutal here, okay? Time for me to be brutal. Lou Reed. God. It's just... I remember reading something about David Bowie, who, God bless his soul, who passed away about 6 years ago. David Bowie was quoted as saying that he just thought Lou Reed's music was it back in the 70s, so he supported Lou Reed back when Bowie was a rising star back in the early 70s, and he thought that his music was great, I'm sorry, I just don't see it that way. I've listened to some of Lou Reed's music. I've been aware of him for decades, and his music sucks. It just does. And you know why I'm being brutal? Because he was brutal. So it's going to come right back at him because he deserves it. Anyway. Lou Reed, yeah, he was brutal. He thought everybody sucked. he never had a kind word to say about anybody, about anybody's music. He thought he literally thought he was the best. And so, but you listen to his music. Well, you might say, well, how could his music suck? The Wild Side was great. Oh yeah, he had that hit, The Wild Side. Um, I gotta admit, that song doesn't do much for me, but I can see that song has something to it. It has a talent, a vibe to it. I'm not gonna deny that. But listen to his other stuff. It's. I don't honestly. I don't see what David Bowie saw in his music. I just don't know why he uh, supported his music, because there's nothing to it. He just sung about drug addicts and not not uplifting stuff. I believe in being real in the lyrics. Don't get me wrong, but that's what he was all about. Just singing about junkies and the seedy life in the city. Too New York for me, man. I'm too New York, and the music just sucks. He's got this very mediocre voice, singing voice, and it just lacks. It just almost completely lacks. There's no life in it. And I know people think Lou Reed, he's genius. Oh my God, he's just whatever. No, he's not a genius. His music sucks, but overrated. Um, and yes, Lou Reed was a complete egomaniac. Absolutely. I mean, he always was dissing everybody's music, even though what he said about the Beatles. He said they suck. They suck completely. They're worthless. Everything they said, they did bombs, stinks. My music will outlast their music. Blah blah. It's more important than the music. But he was always saying stuff like that. But and then Bowie was supporting some other groups that I think I can't. I'm trying to think what other artists or groups that he was supporting that I think were overrated, but it'll come to me, I guess, as I continue on here. Um, yeah, Bowie had some odd taste in music. I remember reading an article where he lists like 20, 30 of his favorite artists and groups, and I'm looking at this list. I'm saying, what? I mean, not one mention of Yes, not one mention of Genesis, or any of these monstrous groups that were truly innovative. Not even King Crimson. He doesn't even mention King Crimson, I think. He's just mentioning these mediocre, no talent hacks like Lou Reed and other groups like that. Uh, like, oh yeah, what's his name? Iggy Pop? I think his name is Iggy, one of the proto-punk guys that came out. I like Iggy Pop. I think he's got a great personality. But man, he's overrated. I mean, I don't know why David Bowie was lauding his music. He was supporting him. I get the fact that those two guys were really great friends of each other, and I love that. They bonded with each other pretty well throughout the 70s. That's great stuff. But overrated. I mean, you look at his stuff. Iggy Pop and the Stooges, because he started out in the Stooges, right, in the late 60s, early 70s, and I'm not saying it's garbage or anything, but it is severely overrated. I mean, I see it for what it is. It's proto-punk, so it has its place in history as far as its significance in the long scheme of things. But man, I see it as very severely overrated. I think the New York Dolls is much better, and I don't recall Bowie ever saying anything about the Dolls. He may have, but I don't think he did. The Dolls, if you want to go to proto-punk, that's where it's at. The New York Dolls, 1973, they hit the scene in 72, 73, 74, and then they disbanded. These guys from Manhattan, they were the queens, the queens of Manhattan at that time. and a huge formative influence of of a rising group at that time in that same area called Kiss, which was later to become Kiss. Huge influence on Kiss. Uh, of course, what's his name? The guy, Buster Poindexter, that's his stage name, the lead singer of the New York Dolls. Fantastic. Proto-punk. If you want to really want to get into punk, where it originated, try the New York Dolls. That's good stuff for punk. And I'm not really into punk, but that stuff has a winning combination. It has winning ingredients to it. Uh, they were more like a glam band. You look at them; they're all dressed up in mascara and and 7-inch platform boots and shit like that. So they were they were they definitely had quite a get up. Anyway, the whole androgynous sort of look that was very prevalent back in the early 70s. Like what Mark Bolan was doing with. Oh man, I'm having a brain fart. His stage name. You know what I'm talking about. But anyway, oh boy, I'm having a brain fart. I know his stage name. It's obvious, but Mark Bolan. I'm just going by his real name there. Mark Bolan. Let's talk about Mark Bolan. Get it on, banga. The Banga Gong song. That's what he's most famous for. I've never really been a fan of his stuff. Do I think he's overrated? I think he is a bit overrated. But there's something to his stuff. I can see it. He hit the scene back in the late '60s. He started out in the late '60s. English. And he was one of the first glam boys. He was glamming it up way back in the late '60s, 1969, '70. And I don't know. To be honest, I don't know much about the Mark Bolan literature. I just don't. I should read up more on him. He died at the very young age of 30, if I'm not mistaken, in 1976 in a car crash. God rest his soul. David Bowie really looked up to him. It's like, oh yeah, this guy, he's it. It's just another case of David Bowie overrating groups and artists. Don't get me wrong. Mark Bolan definitely had a lot more talent than Lou Reed, in my opinion. There was something that Mark Bolan had it right. He had the looks and he had the swagger, right? And he had, and he had the songs to back it up. But I've just never really been into his thing. It's not my thing, right? But do I think he's overrated? I think he has been overrated by people like David Bowie. I don't know what's going through his head. Just ignored really, really, truly fabulous groups and just fixated on these other guys that, that was his choice, whatever. That was just what Bowie was all about at that time, I guess. But anyway. Anyway, so moving on. I wish I could say more about Mark Bolan. He had a bit of an ego too. Of course, any rock star has an ego. But this guy, he was kind of a narcissist. He always surrounded himself with yes men. So he lived in a very insular world. So he never heard what people really thought of him. He didn't get any constructive criticism. So as a result, his art tended to stagnate. So if you look at his stuff in 1970, 71, 72, and then compare it to what he was doing just before he died in 1976, it sounds exactly the same. He didn't make any evolution in his music or in his stage act. All because he was insulated by people who protected him, and so they always say, oh, you're great, you're a god, so he, believed it, of course, and he was a real nice fellow, this sweet guy. He just, had like this childlike narcissism, wasn't malicious or anything. And he passed away much too soon. So anyway, whoops, just had a real moment there. That was rock and roll. That was totally unplanned. Anyway, an escaped convict, but oh, okay. So moving on. Let's talk about the Sex Pistols, I guess. People think that the Sex Pistols invented punk rock. They didn't invent punk rock. They capitalized on it. Here's an interesting thing about it. Did you know the Sex Pistols never identified themselves as a punk rock band? And the leader of the group, the infamous and lovable Johnny Rotten, or otherwise known as John Lydon, never identified as punk. He said, "I'm not punk. We're not punk. My music has never been punk." But they've just been lumped into that category by other people. So they did not invent punk rock. They capitalized on a music form that already had its beginnings as early as the late '60s. With the Stooges, groups like that. The MC5, of course, another late '60s group, which disbanded in '70 or '71 or so. A Detroit group. They were based in Detroit. The MC5, that is. So the Sex Pistols, they came out of that milieu and they capitalized on it. Put out a classic. They put out one classic album called Nevermind the Bollocks in late '77. They were just really they had a really good guitarist. I forget his name. I'm horrible at names. Really good guitarist. They weren't bad musicians for a punk rock group. They were decent, except the bassist. And you know who the bassist was? Not the original bassist, Sid, but the one who Sid Vicious. He replaced the original bassist. I forget who the original bassist was, but Sid Vicious, horrible bassist, horrible bass player. Just horrible. Just watch his live performances. But the other guys, decent at their instruments, and of course John Lydon or Johnny Rotten, in his infamous singing style. How can I duplicate this? I know he would just go right up to the microphone and say, "I am the Antichrist." However that song goes. I wanna be anarchy. I can't do it. I can't do it justice. But it's great stuff. It's great to watch. But I'm not a punk band. I just look at it from a historical interest in how it played its part in the historical movement of punk rock. But Johnny Lydon or Johnny Rotten is really noted for his personality than for his music. He left. Well, the Sex Pistols disbanded in '78 or somewhere around there. They only put out one album, and from then on, John Lydon formed a group called Public. I'm trying to remember the exact name of Public Ltd. or something to that effect. Pardon me if I got that wrong. And they produced a number of albums in the late '70s and throughout the '80s. I'm not sure, maybe into the '90s. Pardon me for my sketchy knowledge and on all that. And I've listened to very little of it. I've seen very little of it. My initial impression of his group during this time, late '70s and early '80s, it sounds very. It doesn't really sound punk. It sounds very art rock, almost like art rock. Very, very art rock, but very, what's the word, atonal type sounding stuff, you know. It's kind of hard to describe it. Very experimental sounding. Johnny Rotten is a overwhelming personality, very lovable, but he's extremely brutal and honest. That's why he's very much loved, because he just calls a spade, and of course he's hated by the haters who don't like that. But yeah, I make it a point of watching his stuff on YouTube, just to watch his rants, just because he's just a hoot to watch. Anyway, enough of that. Let's take another swig of water. What could be noteworthy to speak? What noteworthy group can we talk about, or artists? That's hmm. Maybe I'll just leave it off here, and I'll continue on with this maybe tomorrow. I think I've spoken my piece for now. Yeah, this is just my honest thoughts. I'm not even pretending to be objective here. Okay, this is all my own personal biased opinion. You know, when I'm saying that Lou Reed's music is and all this, I'm not even pretending to be objective here. This is just my own personal opinions. Okay, so, but I stick with it. I stick with those opinions, right? And I do take personal issue with Bowie's opinions and his overlauding some of these groups, but I love Bowie anyway. So anyway, all right, thanks for watching, folks, and much love to all of you. Shalom and namaste.